Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 850, and today is November 3rd, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Got a lot to talk about on today's show. Want to jump right into it. First, just remind people to check out my Twitter feed. That's where I post all the articles I write, whether at antiwar.com, judgenap.com, or the Libertarian Institute, where I do most of my writing. I publish this show, the Kyle Anzalone Show, and very exciting, we are now over 10,000 followers on Twitter. It took quite a bit of time to get there. For a couple months. It felt like every time I was within like 10 of hitting 10,000, it would reset me back down to about 50 away. And so I had to work my way up. I got a little bit of a bump, so I'm well over that hurdle now. Very excited. And of course, as always, I appreciate all of your support and sharing all the articles and work that I put out. I am not great at marketing myself. I really rely on you guys to help me out with that shortcoming so I can really just stay dived in and focus on all the news. That way I could talk about all this stuff with the depth of knowledge that I feel like I need to be able to give you guys like really good comprehensive information and analysis. So again, thank you all so much, and let's jump into the news today. First up here, it looks like war with Venezuela is more likely. I wrote this article for The Second at antiwar.com. Report: Trump has decided to bomb military targets in Venezuela. So on Thursday, I guess I should say, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal that said the Trump administration had drawn up plans to attack Venezuela, but Donald Trump had not approved them. Then when we get to Friday, the Miami Herald says they spoke with sources who said that this war is going on. A couple reasons why I do think that the Miami Herald is probably going to be a source that everybody wants to read when it comes to the potential war with Venezuela. And just on the Trump administration in general, is first, how many top Trump administration officials are from or reside in Venezuela? Of course, Pam Bondi has a lot of power. I think the head of ICE is from Florida. Marco Rubio, of course, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. And then, of course, Donald Trump himself resides in California. And so I think that particular faction of the Republican Party probably has more influence than they would in a typical administration. And one of the reasons that's important is when it comes to Latin America, because of the large population of Cuban American, Venezuelan Americans, and from other Latin American countries. And many of these people are exiled from the communist regimes that either did exist or still exist in Latin America. And they agitate for the U.S. to go in. And, they see it as fixing up their home countries, but installing, governments that they view as being more friendly into power. So this is, So anyways, keep your eye on the Miami Herald is the point of that. So what the Herald is particularly reporting is that Trump had approved the strikes on targets of the leadership of Cartel de los Soles. So that cartel does not currently exist. It exists back in Venezuela. The U.S. used it, the CIA in particular, for their influence campaigns in Venezuela, but it has really since gone defunct. And even the U.S. intelligence community and other fairly establishment sources, even the Atlantic, Nancy Youssef, had said that, she spoke with sources who said that the Cartel de los Soles and the Maduro government is not the same thing. The Maduro government isn't involved in drug trafficking. And most importantly, they're not involved in trafficking narcotics. So, one of the quotes that I did want to read here, one of the sources told the outlet, Maduro is about to find himself trapped and might soon discover that he cannot flee the country even if he decided to. What's worse for him, there is just more than one general willing to capture and hand him over, fully aware that one thing is to talk about death and another to see it coming. And so I think there's maybe three pieces of this I want to break down here. First off, this is another Trump administration official basically saying the goal is regime change. I mean, the writing's on the wall. The Marco Rubio over the summer, I believe it was in July, designated Cartel de los Soles and TDA as narco-terrorist cartels and put them on the foreign terrorist organizations list. Anybody who's paid attention to American foreign policy over the past 2 decades knows that when you're on the foreign terrorism list, that is essentially the equivalent to a modern day declaration of war. Our country will do everything it can to overthrow the government in your country, or, attack whatever group is listed on the foreign terror organizations list. So that was a really big deal. Of course, we know that Donald Trump approved military operations against countries on the foreign terror organization list. And so those strikes started in September. And of course, they have been limited to international waters. I think 10 now in the Caribbean and 5 in the Pacific off the coast of Colombia there. And then the ones in the Caribbean, boats leaving Venezuela. And the Trump administration claims that, these boats are headed to the United States. And I guess they're they really haven't explained their justification for it. I think they're working on 2 justifications. One would just be that anything listed on the foreign terror organization list is able to be targeted for strikes by the United States government. And this, of course, is just stretching the 2001 AUMF beyond all recognition. Of course, it's already been stretched to fight every jihadist group, or essentially Muslim group, right? Because, we've used it to fight against the Houthis in Yemen and things like that too, who are enemies of Al-Qaeda. But, any Muslim group that we don't like, from Morocco to the Philippines, we have used the 2001 authorization of use of military force to attack those countries. Now, at least most of those groups have been jihadist groups, right? Like, I'm not saying that just because somebody somewhere in some desert or in some cave, hiding out in some mountain, living in some city, somewhere in North Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, any Muslim majority nation, just because somebody in that country says, I work for Osama bin Laden, I work for Al-Qaeda, yay, jihadism. That isn't the 2001 authorization for use of military force does not allow that. However, at least you could kind of stretch the text of the 2001 AUMF to make it believable, right? It's not just wildly, completely crazy. And of course, extending into the alleged narco-terrorist in Latin America would just be absurd beyond all belief. Now, the second justification is, I think Trump is basically saying that this is defending our own borders. When you're bombing a drug boat that's going to bring drugs into the United States, Americans are going to die, and therefore we could kill you. Now, I guess multiple problems with this would, of course, be, can anybody bringing anything illegal and potentially dangerous into the United States then be killed, right? Like, let's say somebody's trying to smuggle, a tiger into the United States. Not a full-grown one, like a tiger cub. These kind of things happen, I swear. And, one day it could grow up, it could get out of its cage, and then you got a tiger on the loose. So can we blow up those people? Unhealthy foods, or any kind of, what about like people illegally smuggling like other things into the United States that, again, could be borderline dangerous if used improperly. People drink cleaning products and end up getting, right, like, there are other things. So that doesn't at all seem to be reasonable whatsoever. And it's kind of backed up with the problem that if the Trump administration is saying that, look, these boats are loaded up with fentanyl, and all that's on them is fentanyl, and this really is a dangerous drug that's killing probably 100,000 or so Americans every year, and so we're going to carry out strikes. Not quite the same thing as bringing a tiger cub into the United States. The problem is, there's no evidence that these boats are smuggling drugs. The only real thing that the Pentagon has said to give any indication that they have evidence that these boats are smuggling drugs is they say they were traveling on known drug routes. My guess is the problem with that is people smuggle a lot of things, and my guess is they use similar routes. Also in waterways and things like that, there's probably best ways to just travel and go from place to place. And so it's not impossible that fishermen aren't taking a similar route, or maybe they're violating the law a little bit by selling the fish they catch in certain waters and other waters. Like, again, these are all things that happen. So we really don't know that the people we're killing are smuggling drugs. We don't know those drugs are coming to the U.S. In fact, it seems like if they're going anywhere, it's to Trinidad and Tobago, where they will then almost always end up in Europe. Another problem with that, of course, is that the drugs being smuggled from Venezuela don't contain fentanyl. They're mostly cocaine, not even heroin. And it's a tiny percentage of the cocaine that comes into the United States of America, right? This is the cocaine that's keeping the Miami nightclubs open. This isn't the cocaine that's laced with fentanyl from Mexico and killing people across the country. That's just not what's happening here. So the Trump administration, I think, doesn't really have a good argument there. Now, another piece of all of this is the PSYOP angle, and I really do want to take the time to highlight this, to float this possibility. And this isn't necessarily me trying to give Trump an out. I'm just trying to explain the different things that are going on here. Look, the New York Times, when the story came out that the White House had approved lethal covert CIA operations in Venezuela, that wasn't hard-hitting journalism. That wasn't Seymour Hersh, Mads Blumenthal, Matt Taibbi, somebody doing real, actual journalism, getting a scoop, putting out information that the U.S. government didn't want us to know. It was an official lead to the New York Times by the Trump administration. And so they want to put that out there. The mock bombing runs, the massive deployment of military power to the Caribbean, this could all be an effort to have a regime change in Caracas, but that doesn't include military action. Now, if we do this, we're likely going to see a lot of the same consequences as if the U.S. had conducted a drone strike and killed Maduro that way. Important to note that, right? Like, this isn't to say that this is a good policy. I'm not trying to justify. I'm just explaining that it's a possibility that this could all be a psychological war operation, that the Trump administration is trying to either kind of do what Israel did when it came to Iran, where they start bombing and then they call the generals and nuclear scientists and say, make a video of yourself defecting or you'll be next. And so they're trying to make the people under Maduro think that they're going to war, and those people then have to decide if they're willing to trade their life for Maduro and his government. Now, we've tried this before with Venezuela. We've tried to create defection and have generals bring reins. There was a phenomenal interview between Matt Blumenthal and former Green Beret, I think Juan Guaidó, I believe is his name. And he was the man who tried to arrange the coup in Venezuela during Trump's first administration, dubbed the Bay of Piglets. And in his interview with Matt, he explains how, they reached out to generals. They thought they had generals who were prepared to defect, and they didn't. And I've read reporting that the Maduro government knew about this all the time. They knew that these generals were being paid because these generals were meeting with, the American proxies, Guaidó's men, Guaido's representatives and things like that, and then going to Maduro and say, I was made this offer. And they play into it because then the U.S. attempts a regime change in Venezuela. That's going to make Maduro more popular. Maduro lets his generals line their pockets with some, off the books money that doesn't come from him, and so he probably creates some loyalty to himself that way. He also probably has some now little bit of blackmail. Like, what if one day he's really actually worried about this general defecting, and so now he basically says, oh, this general was going to defect and we stopped him back then, but now we're going to arrest him. So, right, like, I think the failed coup actually ends up creating for a ton of reasons, a lot of benefits for Maduro and his staying power in Venezuela. And then, of course, that this message is directed at Maduro himself. I do think there, at least some people in the administration, are not necessarily targeting, the underlings and threatening them, but just hoping that Maduro will be willing to give up power and leave. Either way, I do think strikes are likely at this point in time inside of Venezuela. I'm not sure where the Trump administration will start, how slowly they will escalate this war. While it kind of made sense, especially since there's not a declaration of war, that the president would go about this in a ratchet effect style where it's more a slow uptick where, at first they actually do target a few, Colombian drug labs, warehouses, gangs, cartels, and things like that in Colombia. There certainly are some. I know, particularly around the border region with Colombia, it's all rainforest, right? Like, this is a part of the Amazon. And so I imagine it's fairly difficult to prevent all smuggling over that border, to be able to know exactly who's out there. Different militants from Colombia cross over, hide out in Venezuela and establish a presence there. They try to recruit, things like that. So, there are some militia, FARC linked people that live out there, and there certainly is some drug smuggling, right? These militias, they fund themselves off of this. They're not able to, all go out, work 9-to-5 jobs because they're hiding out in the rainforest, and so they gotta make money some way. They establish some drug routes, and so anyways, my point is, I'm sure the U.S. could identify, I don't want to use the word legitimate, but non-civilian, non-governmental, non-Venezuelan military targets that hit in Venezuela, and stop maybe some cocaine trafficking coming to the U.S. that way. Not a good policy. I'm just saying that it's possible. And from there, once they hit their first round of targets and the drug traffickers find another way, Maduro stays in power, then they're going to start hitting the Venezuelan military, civilian targets, governmental targets, and eventually they'll try to, just drive Maduro from power. My guess, knowing Donald Trump, is that they would use airstrikes. Now, the one thing is, we have Donald Trump in the White House. And so I think it's worth considering here that rather than the ratchet effect, he would just go for a knockout blow right away. He doesn't want to get bogged down in some long, drawn-out conflict. We saw that in Yemen, right? Heavy bombing over the course of, I think, 10 weeks maybe, and then he decides it's not worth it and leaves, right? Iran, that's one night of airstrikes that he agreed to, right? It wasn't that he bombed Iran once, he bombed Iran twice, then he conducted this big round of bombing. It was one bombing and then we're done with it. Now, I'm not saying that's a good policy. I'm not saying he can't get drugged back into those conflicts. Just to say, my only real point here is that Donald Trump could try to do something similar in Venezuela. Now, one last thing I want to note on this story is that Marco Rubio did deny the report. That's unsurprising completely. All right, I think that's what I have on Venezuela. I do want to mention that today I am running, for those of you subscribed to the Libertarian Institute newsletter, you can find this. I wrote basically an article on this that I sent out. And additionally, I published it at judgesnap.com, so subscribers of that website can read it as well. Now, this is, I think, probably the most important story I wrote last week. Just before meeting Xi, Trump directs Department of War to start testing nuclear weapons. And so I do want to read Trump's post on Truth Social. I think he posted it at 9 p.m. and he was scheduled to meet with Xi at 10 p.m. Of course, this was in South Korea, so the meeting actually occurs on Thursday. It's Wednesday still in the United States, but you get the point. 1 hour before the meeting, Trump writes this on Truth Social. The United States has more nuclear weapons than any other country. This was accomplished including a complete update and renovation of existing weapons during my first term in office. Russia is second and China a distant third, but it will be even within 5 years. Because of other countries' testing programs, I have instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately. All right. So this, of course, sounds really, really, really terrible because it sounds like Trump ordered the Pentagon to test a nuclear weapon. The Secretary of Energy, I believe, said that the U.S. doesn't have plans to test a nuclear weapon. And I'm sure the Pentagon does have plans more or less drawn up. I'm sure they update them every couple of years on if the president ordered to test the nuclear weapons. This is the materials we would need, where we could do it, what kind of bomb would be the most useful. During I believe Trump's first administration, it could have even been during Biden, it was several years ago, the Pentagon was talking about doing what they call tickling the dragon's tail. And this is a atomic explosion of a nuclear weapon. I don't necessarily understand the physics of what's happening there, but it would be a massive, massive underground explosion and underground test. And while the White House might not say that's a violation of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Russia might think it is. And let's say Russia isn't so interested in tickling the dragon's tail, and they say, we would rather just go ahead and conduct this operation and go ahead and just test our nuclear weapon. If you're effectively violating the test ban treaty, then we'll just go ahead and completely ignore it. And I think that's a real possibility here too. I think if the U.S. tests a nuclear weapon, then China, Russia, India, I don't know about Pakistan, North Korea, if they want to test a nuclear, you know what, the U.S. testing a nuclear weapon could push North Korea to test another nuclear weapon, although I think they could do that independently of the U.S. testing a nuclear weapon. So, we could see a lot of other countries test nuclear weapons. Now, we ran an article last week at antiwar.com by, I think his name is Leon Haldar, and what he explains is that, look, the Americans, we have the best data on nuclear weapons explosions. We, tracked, recorded it, and at this point, our computer models for nuclear explosions and understanding what would happen if we dial this up, dial this down, use different materials, different missiles, all those kinds of things, we're going to understand it better than anyone else because of our data bank on data from nuclear tests. Like, we have a distinct advantage there currently. But at this point in time, if Russia, China, India all test, North Korea test nuclear weapons again, maybe not North Korea, but certainly Russia, China, India, they're going to be able to gather an extreme amount of data on their nuclear tests, and they're going to bridge the gap, right? When, you don't know a lot, it's easy to learn a lot about a topic quicker than if you know a lot. You're going to have to learn, go through a lot of work to refine and learn that little bit more, right? That's what kind of how things work. It's easy to get to 50% proficiency, but that could be done 1 through 50 could be done a lot faster than 90 to 95, even though it's less gap, it's just more intense information, right? So I think that's what we're looking at here. Now, Xi didn't seem to let this get in the way of his summit with Donald Trump. There were some things agreed to at that summit. I think China agreed to pause their new restrictions on rare earth, mineral, and magnet exports, as well as some restrictions on semiconductor exports that they were planning on putting in place. they agreed to roll those back. So I think they have restrictions on like 5 of the rare earth minerals already. I think they are going to increase that number to 12, and there are 17 total. And so they agreed to put a hold on those additional 7, not roll them all back. And in exchange, the U.S. cut the fentanyl tariffs from 20 to 10%, which I think the way the tariffs are compounded, it did effectively lower the tariff rate by 41%. So that this is a significant step. It does seem that that meeting was somewhat positive. After the meeting, Trump said 2, I think, contradictory things, although I'm not really sure. First, he said that Taiwan didn't come up in his meeting with Xi. And as far as I'm concerned, that seems like a good thing. And then he later said that Xi promised him that he wouldn't invade Taiwan during his administration. I have no idea if the second one's true, if the first one's true, if there's a little bit of truth to both of them. Like maybe at one point during the meeting, she said something like, you don't need to worry about Taiwan. And that was the end of the conversation on it. In that case, both things Trump said are mostly true. It could also be that they talked about Taiwan for an hour and she said, you know, I won't invade if you back off. And Trump more or less said, I won't give you a reason to invade or something like that. It could really go either way at this point. So I did think that was interesting and notable. Overall, we will see how the relationship between China and the U.S. moves forward from here. We've certainly seen rollbacks and improvements in the trade war in the past, only to have it then tip back up and exacerbate. So next up here, this article I wrote for the Institute on October 30th. Netanyahu says Israel has more work to do in Gaza. And the thing I want to cover kind of around this story ties in with this one as well. Vance claims Trump applied leverage to Israel to secure Israeli ceasefire. And also this story that I wrote for the Institute on November 2nd. 2/3 of Israelis believe the U.S. is calling the shots on military policy. Now, the reason I think all these things are important is there is a perception in Israel that, and according to the poll conducted by Channel 12 in Israel, 2/3 of Israelis say that the U.S. has more influence, more decision-making power when it comes to Israel's military policy, wars in Iran, Gaza, Lebanon, elsewhere in the Middle East than Netanyahu does. And 70% of Israelis said that Israel was a client state of the U.S. And so Netanyahu is trying to push back on that narrative. And the way he's doing that is he's saying that we are going to go back to war in Gaza. And so I think Netanyahu is painting himself into a little bit of a corner here where he's going to feel compelled that he has to go back into Gaza because this is the way he asserts Israeli sovereignty over the U.S. Now, Vance is saying that Trump applied leverage to Netanyahu could be something that was workshopped before the event by the Trump administration. Israel's a major topic of conversation, particularly among young Americans, even young Republicans at this point. Even if they're not particularly concerned about the plight of the Palestinians, they are certainly concerned about the special relationship the United States has with Israel. I think a lot of them are probably fans of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and they see the Israeli lobby and the Israelis coming after her. And, that's just adding fuel to the fire and making them ask more questions about the situation in Israel. So anyways, my overall point here is it could have been that Vance was prepared to answer that question, and he did so in a way that did 2 things. He didn't say anything bad about the Israelis. He didn't say they didn't want to do it, or anything. He just said Trump applied leverage. It's vague enough that it doesn't mean much of anything, but if you do want to read something into it, you can. And so it's possible that that's all Vance was doing. It was a very carefully articulated answer. It could be that Vance was just trying to downplay what happened. And Trump maybe stuck his finger in Netanyahu's chest behind closed doors. And he said, you will agree to this ceasefire, you will comply with it, or Israel will lose military aid from the United States. And I know you need it. You have no choice. I really doubt Trump said that. It's possible he did. Vance now trying to downplay that because, of course, I think if he says that publicly, not only will he get a ton of backlash from the Israel lobby, it may, in a way, make Netanyahu feel cornered as well and kind of feel that he has to lash out. So I think all this is just setting the stage. I think it's almost assured that Israel is going to go back to war in Gaza in the coming months here, if not weeks at this point. And it's not as if that war has stopped. First up, I just want to mention here, the Gaza Health Ministry says 236 Palestinians killed since the start of the ceasefire, and over 500 bodies have been recovered. Of course, the most significant number of deaths was, I believe, last Tuesday when 104 Palestinians, including 46 civilians, were killed. But Israel is just killing Palestinians daily. We've gone from it being, as Scott Horton likes to say, a Waco massacre of Palestinians every day. Somewhere between 50 and 125 Palestinians were being killed every single day by the Israelis. And for anybody who questions that that's intentional, Israeli members of the Knesset, might have even been Betzalel Smotrich, said, look, we could kill 100 Palestinians a day and no one cares. And that certainly is true. Like that is the one thing that they've been able to get away with, is killing 100 Palestinians a day with airstrikes and military force. Now, where they got, I think, even into more trouble than killing people with bombs was killing people through starvation. The starving pictures of children really just invoke a strong emotional response in people. And even when, you see a bunch of exploded people, even if they're children on the ground, I think for people, it somehow feels like there could be some justification of, it wasn't Israel's fault. Hamas was there. They didn't want to kill those kids. The Hamas guy who was going to pose a threat to Israel, who was going to kill, rape, murder Israeli children, was hiding amongst Palestinian children. And unfortunately, in that scenario, a lot of Palestinian children die. Like, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that's rationalizations that I think people can make. People can't rationalize starving. Normal people can't rationalize whatsoever starving children to death. And I think that's where Israel got into a lot of trouble. So we've seen very little complaints about Israel's rampant ceasefire violations. When they've conducted a couple dozen strikes in a single day, which I believe has now happened 2 times in the 3 weeks since the ceasefire went into effect. They've gotten, told to knock it off. But other than that, they've been allowed to keep going. Now, one other thing here I think the more significant ceasefire violation here is that the humanitarian situation in Gaza isn't getting any better. Last week, I wrote this for a Libertarian Institute. The Al-Shifa hospital says patients are dying due to a lack of medical supplies. And so the director of the hospital told Al Jazeera that, look, when all those people were slaughtered last week, over 100 Palestinians, they were arriving at the facility, they couldn't treat them because they didn't have the medical supplies. And there were people dying who could have otherwise survived because they didn't have the supplies. And he also said, look, we're coming up on a time here where we're struggling to run the dialysis machines, and we got hundreds of thousands of Palestinians with chronic health conditions. People who have older parents and grandparents know that without regular healthcare visits, without being able to blood pressure medicine, water pills, blood thinners, insulin, there's tons and tons and tons of prescription and healthcare issues that are, in the West, people have them and they're still got decades to live, right? Even heart failure, high blood pressure, risk of stroke, all diabetes or kidney failure, all these things people are able to live with for decades on. But in Gaza, where those basic medical supplies aren't available, they're increasingly at risk of death. And so, when we talk about the death toll from the war in Gaza and people say the 67,000 number, of course that's an undercount because we know there's a lot more Palestinians who have been killed and their bodies haven't been recovered, maybe a lot of them to never be recovered. However, there's other deaths that weren't counted as well. Somebody who had a heart attack, and because there wasn't a hospital, there wasn't a road, there wasn't a ambulance, there wasn't doctors, medical staffs, beds, they end up dying. People who have cancer who aren't able to get MRIs, CAT scans, and all kinds of other screenings, blood tests, urine tests, all those things that they do for early diagnosis, catch cancer early, treat it early. None of that is happening right now in Gaza. And so when we look at the death toll from this conflict, it's not even going to be the people who died from the war, the people who had an injury from the war that got infected or something like that and later died, or even just the starvation deaths, but all the extra deaths of people who could have otherwise been okay if it wasn't for what the Israelis were doing to their home. All right, everyone, that is where I'm going to wrap up today's show. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I will be back with another episode of Conflicts of Interest on Thursday. Kyle Anzalone Show Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 4:45 Eastern Time. Monday's show is with Matt Wolfson, and I will be back on Judge Nap today at 2 p.m. Eastern. Very excited about that. Thanks, everyone.